Hello friends, this is the lesson number 28 and it is in fact the third part of our discussion on Mathew Arnold as a literary critic. In the previous lesson we discussed touchstone method and now in this lesson we shall start our journey about his practical criticism. What is practical criticism? Actually, there exists a difference. When we talk about criticism, it means that you are saying that this any particular poem or poetry or prose drama is good or not. But practical criticism here we takes the text of that means poem and we analyze that text whether it is a good one or not. So practical criticism, what we are going to discuss here is the foundation of the new criticism or the practical criticism. That is the main topic of our cultural study that we discuss just after 2 or 3 lessons we shall start. Because even in the beginning of the first lesson on Mathew Arnold, I told you that Mathew Arnold is considered as the first modern critic. And why he is considered? Because he really gives the foundation or tells us what are the basic concept of the new criticism or practical criticism. So here he is talking about how to analyze or what he has analyzed the real text of some of his you can say the previous writers of the ancient writers or the great writers. So we are going to start this discussion. So he names several writers. Who are these? Like Chaucer, Dryden, Pope, Thomas Gray, Burne, Robert Burne, and William Shakespeare. And he first talks about Chaucer, Sir Geoffrey Chaucer. We know the great writer, and he says he praises him, no doubt, but he does not consider him as the great classic writer or the you can say the writer that should be considered among the likes of Shakespeare, Milton, or Homer, Dante. He says that Chaucer, if you remember that in the British literature segment I discussed that the life of Chaucer or his literary period was divided in 3 segments, where he was influenced by French literature, then by Italian, and then by the English literature. So in these 3 segments it was considered as the 3, you can say, the spans of his life. And when he was under the influence of the French writers, he was basically nourished by the romantic poets of French language, and during the writings in Italian he was quite influenced by the royal rhyme stanza. And Dryden, another critic, John Dryden, and he says he admires Sir Geoffrey Chaucer. In fact, it was a question as well in the UGC NET exam when Dryden says, "Here is a God's plenty." Here is a God's plenty. To whom Dryden is referring here? Here Dryden is referring to Sir Geoffrey Chaucer's, that is, Canterbury Tale, because in Canterbury Tales we have a large list of characters representing to the different sections of the society. Anyway, Mathew Arnold quite agrees that Chaucer is a great writer, no doubt. He says that he is not a corrupt writer, he is a good writer, but he is not that great or classic writer. He has the freedom in his writing, in his works, spontaneity is there in his works, but he does not have that poetic seriousness. Because in Canterbury Tales, even in the other works, you will find that he is just writing simply with, you can say, casual approach. That poetic seriousness someone sees in John Milton or Shakespeare or Homer, that is not found in his works. So that is why Mathew Arnold does not rate Chaucer as the great classic writer. Here the term classic you can take as the means the great writers. So he is not considering him apt for touchstone method. So that is why in the previous video I mentioned that for touchstone means for making comparison of any work with the great works of Milton, Shakespeare, Homer or Dante, but he is not recommending that one should go for the works of Chaucer, because works of Chaucer are not of that high seriousness. Somewhere they are vulgar as well. You can even go through his works, and even you can go to the British literature segment where I have mentioned or discussed several of his works. So next he talks about John Dryden and Alexander Pope. If you remember, both these writers belong to the Restoration Age. What is the Restoration Age? Just try to get an idea that when the theaters were you can say started, that was called as the restore. Restore means to start again. So the theaters were started again. So that was the period of Restoration, and during that period the prose writing was quite, you can say, encouraged, not the poetry. And that is why Mathew Arnold feels that both John Dryden and Alexander Pope both are better prose writer. They are not great poets, so they are not as the classics of poetry, so they are also not apt for touchstone method. So during the period, remember 1660, yes, 1660 to 1700 or so, and furthermore we have the Restoration period, and during that period we have Pope and Dryden, and they were mostly writing prose. Okay, poetry was also there, but they are hailed more as a prose writer, so they are not as the good example of you can say classic poetry, so not apt for touchstone method. The next one he discussed, that is Thomas Gray. About him, he was writing in the 18th century prominently, and Thomas Gray is also considered as the precursor of the Romantics or pre-Romantic poet. So Mathew Arnold considered him as a great classic writer. For making any sort of, you can say, comparison in poetry, he considered him, but he also said that he did not write much, though in the 18th century he takes only him as an example of classic writer. But he said that he did not write much, but whatever he wrote, that was of a great value, of a great high poetic value. And he also said that because Thomas Gray read Greek poetry a lot. When Thomas Gray was studying, he went through Greek poetry of Homer and other writers. So that is why, under the impact of these writers, these famous Greek poets, under their impact, Thomas Gray established himself as a great classic writer, but his works are pretty limited. Among his works, the one famous poem you might have heard, Elegy Written in the Country's Churchyard, and so that sort of means a limited work is available about him, or he has written, not available, he has written only limited work. So he considered him, but at the same time he also rejected him because of the lack of the works that he wrote. Then we have Robert Burns. He was also writing in the 18th century, and for him Mathew Arnold says that he wrote about moral issues, no doubt. In his poetry we find that moral issues are raised, but there is insincerity in this. Means how he takes these moral issues, that the way is very insincere, and he lacks that poetic seriousness. So poetic seriousness is not there as in Chaucer, and even in his personal life he was not that moral. So when you have a person, he is not morally good in his personal life and talking about moral things with insincere way, so he is criticizing that Robert Burns is also not a classic writer. He should not be apt for making any sort of a comparison. And further he says that most of the subject matter, whatever he took in his poetry, is not that good. Even he considered that Chaucer was a bit better than Robert Burns, because in the Chaucer's poetry we find richness, fluidity is there, but in Robert Burns' poetry it is not there. And further, one more point he adds that Robert Burns is a better Scottish, because in Scottish language also he wrote, that is much better, but in English he is not that good at all. So that is why he does not suit for any sort of, you can say, comparison with the greats of Shakespeare or so. And at last, or in the end, we come to William Shakespeare, what Mathew Arnold has to say about him. Now, for last 2 or 3 lessons, we are just seeing that Mathew Arnold has always giving examples of William Shakespeare or admiring William Shakespeare. So here he quote William Shakespeare in a way: in England there needs miracle of genius of Shakespeare that can produce balance of minds. So he's saying that Shakespeare is something like a miracle to produce the balance of mind in the people of England. So in a letter to someone, Arnold says that I keep saying, Shakespeare, you are as obscure as life is. So Shakespeare is quite complicated, but at the same time he says that life is also that sort of obscure. So he's admiring Shakespeare, and he points out several qualities of William Shakespeare, that he is a classic writer because he has that style that quite similar to the ancient ones, and further his themes are mostly based on the ancient works, or of the, like he has written on Henry the VIII, Henry the VI, Richard, the King Richard. So most of his works are based on the classic works, even Romeo Juliet, King Lear, Julius Caesar, Antony and Cleopatra. So many works of his are quite, you can say, inspired from the classic or ancient themes and topics. So that is why Mathew Arnold is praising William Shakespeare. And further he adds that one can have a real feeling in his works. Emotions are expressed. But when he's talking or he's praising William Shakespeare, at the same time he also points out several faults of him. So that is somewhat we can call as a true criticism. He's not simply blindly saying that Shakespeare is great. He is also pointing out several faults, what he thinks, which are there in Shakespeare's work. The first thing he says about his faults: complexity. Most of his works you will find that quite complex. Mathew Arnold points out that where there is some possibility that the scene or anything could be simpler, but William Shakespeare tend to produce the things in a complex way. So complexity is there in his plays. Second, he says that with that sort of a complexity, he should not be followed by the young writers, especially the style which he chooses. The style in which William Shakespeare wrote, that should not be chosen by the young writers, because it has complexity and it is not easy to be used. And further he says that he has a full dominance of the imagery in his works, and there is no that much simplicity. So simply he is warning the young writers or the beginners that do not imitate Shakespeare, because Shakespeare lacks simplicity. There are complexity in his works. And he gives one example of John Keats, the romantic writer. And John Keats tried to imitate William Shakespeare in his poem that is called as Pot of Basil. The title is Pot of Basil. And in that poem, John Keats failed terribly, because he could not have produced any unity, or even the subject matter was handled quite vaguely. So it wasn't a good attempt at all, because John Keats was trying to imitate William Shakespeare, and that's where he failed. So John Keats, we all know that he died at a young age, so that at a young age he was only a beginner. He did not write that much as Shakespeare did, so he wasn't having that experience, and that is why he failed to imitate him. Then he gives one more example, that is of Italian writer, that is Giovanni Boccaccio. Giovanni Boccaccio, and his famous work is Decameron. And Decameron, just remember this work because that is quite beautiful work and quite famous to Giovanni Boccaccio's name. This is quite main work and important and prominent work we can take. So in this work he handled the same sort of theme quite beautifully. So remember, Shakespeare is praised for being a classic writer, but at the same time somewhat criticized for having complexity in his works, and Mathew Arnold warned the young writers not to imitate him. And he also gives one more example of Italian writer, that is Giovanni Boccaccio's Decameron, which is praised here. Moving on, the next we have, that is the concept of Hellenism and Hebraism. So the concept given by Mathew Arnold, the two concepts, Hellenism and Hebraism. There is a one work or book I mentioned, that in Culture and Anarchy. Culture and Anarchy, in that work he mentioned these two concepts. What is Hellenism and what is Hebraism? Hebraism means he says that do what you do. So you are doing something and you are not questioning it. So you are doing it for faith or for your responsibility, for your duty. You are doing it. You think that it is best for you. You are playing because you like, or you are studying because you think that you have to develop your career. You are praying to God because you have a faith in God. You are simply doing. So that is about actions, that believing in actions. So you are performing some actions for your wish, for your desire, for your any sort of, you can say, faith. So you are doing. That is Hebraism. And what is Hellenism? Hellenism means questioning everything. So if you are playing, why you are playing? You have to question yourself. You are praying to God, why? You are studying, why? Means whatever you are doing, why are you doing this? You have to create questions. You have to doubt your actions. You have to always raising questions on your actions, your thinking. So it is all about somewhere to the theory of Socrates. If you remember, in the beginning of this playlist you will find Socrates. He always recommends that one should question everything. Each and every action of your life is to be questioned. If you are eating something, now you can raise a question and you have answered that yes, I am eating because I have to live, I have to get energy. But if someone asks you, why are you studying? Then you have to give proper answer. You have to think yourself whether you are studying for good reason or not. You are playing, why you are playing? So for everything there has to be a question behind every action. So in the end, what Mathew Arnold says, that there has to be a balance between these two. Means Hebraism and Hellenism both has to be there in our life and in a balance. Hebraism, doing action, and Hellenism means asking or putting question on each and every action. And then Mathew Arnold gives us some example that Greek people used to questions. As I mentioned, Socrates, he was also a Greek and he used to question everything. And in the Bible, he then takes one example. In Bible, it is said that spirit of action means one should simply obey whatever is said by the priest or written in the Bible. It should not be questioned. It should not be challenged. It should be always followed. So that is the theory of Hellenism and Hebraism. So a lot we have discussed in these 3 videos. So now this is the time for these several questions which are asked in the previous year question papers. So we'll try to analyze a few of these questions. First, Poetry is the criticism of life. It is said by Mathew Arnold in the study of poetry. Poetry is the criticism of life. Second, all great literature at bottom, criticism of life. All great literature at bottom, criticism of life. So it is said by Mathew Arnold. Another, it is also a quote. Future of poetry is immense because in poetry our race as time goes on will find an ever surer and surer stay. I repeat, a bit awkward as well. Future of poetry is immense because in poetry our race as time goes on will find, means our race will find an ever surer and surer stay. It is said by Mathew Arnold in the study of the poetry. So the theory of Hellenism and Hebraism is given by Mathew Arnold. Another question. In the study of poetry, Chaucer is not a great classic poet. He takes, remember again the forename, Homer, then Dante, William Shakespeare and Milton are the great classic poets, but Chaucer is not. Another question, Mathew Arnold has written a work that is function of criticism at present time. This is asked several times in the exam. Function of criticism at present time. And one last question, touchstone helps us test truth and seriousness that constitute the best poetry. Touchstone helps us test truth and seriousness that constitute the best poetry. So touchstone is a method being given by Mathew Arnold, and here the term touchstone means the lines or the expressions given by the great masters. Touchstone means the lines or the expressions given by the great masters, and touchstone term coined by Mathew Arnold. And according to Mathew Arnold, it was initially used by or initiated by Longinus and then used by Joseph Edison. But touchstone method entirely, if we see that it belonged to Mathew Arnold. So that's it about Mathew Arnold. So it's been a long journey, 3 videos we cover up, and I hope you must have enjoyed this lesson. Thanks a lot for watching this lesson, and in the next video we shall consider T.S. Eliot, another major critique, and after that we shall soon start our journey into the cultural study. That is very important. So have a great day and enjoy learning English literature.